A fresh path to more confident performance is exactly what my book, Acting Revolution, is about. And it's not a big book, but I'm not going to be able to explain it all to you in this 45-minute session. So if you've got any questions, you need to make a note of them, and you will find the answers in the book. I wanted to tell you something that was really exciting that happened to me about a fortnight ago. I got an email from an actor. This is a university-trained, WAPA-trained actor who'd bought the book and emailed me that she loved it. I can't tell you how exciting that was, because that was the first time that had happened that someone didn't know me had bought the book. And it was really exciting because I realised that, in fact, that will never happen again. The next time it'll be the second person and the third person and so on. It was as exciting as winning an Olympic gold medal. It was a big thrill. And until now, in auditions, she said, I've been flying by the seat of my pants. And she said she'd read it in 2 hours and she was already trying some of the techniques out in auditions, and they were making a difference. So why did she find it so fresh? What was fresh about it for her? Because hopefully there'll be fresh things about it for you. But for me, it's not fresh. I've been working on this for 40 years with hundreds of actors who have tested out the concepts, but also, perhaps more importantly, that they've often contributed to them. And it all started in 1984. And in 1984, I was directing TV drama at the ABC in Melbourne, and I'd probably directed about 10 episodes of different series. And at that point, I had read Stanislavski's An Actor Prepares twice, and I'd been thoroughly inspired by it, but totally confused. I was, as a director, flying by the seat of my pants. And in 1984, by then, the 3 main university-based acting schools had been established in Australia. There was the National Institute in Sydney, and the Victorian College of the Arts in Melbourne, and WAPA in Western Australia. And I asked the ABC casting director at the time, because he was going to all the showcase performances of the graduate actors as they'd finished their course. I asked him which course produced the best actors, and to my surprise, he didn't say NIDA. He said WAPA, which was kind of pleasing because I'm a Western Australian, so that was good. But the next year I asked him, he said it was the VCA this time. And that got me thinking, because universities have very set curriculums. They teach the same thing over and over, and yet we were getting different outcomes. And so it seemed like it wasn't the teaching that was making the difference, that it was maybe just the quality of the actors, the students who were enrolling for the course, that was determining the more productive outcome. And that was certainly what I was seeing in the audition room, that actors often left university still confused and not clear about how to do the job. And also in 1984, Murray Hutchinson, a New Zealander, ran this fantastic actor-director workshop for ABC directors, and Murray explained Stanislavski in a way that made sense. And he explained how subtext worked. It was really clear. And he believed that subtext was the key foundation to complex and believable performances. And he even had a formula that explained the choices an actor should make to make sure that their choice of verb that delivered the subtext was functional, to make sure that it worked. His list was fantastic. The first thing on his list was that the choice to drive your subtext needed to be active, and the way that you did that was label it with a verb. Yep, basic Stanislavski. And the next choice was that the verb you chose needed to be readable to the audience. And for that, he said it had to be externally focused about the other person, externally focused on the other person. Basic Stanislavski again. The next thing he said wasn't so commonly talked about, which was your choice of verb to label or to drive the character's subtext needed to be dramatic. And the thing that made it dramatic was that it was difficult to achieve. This is because difficulty is the main ingredient that drives any story. And his next one was also really interesting. He said, your choice needs to produce the result of complexity. It needs to be complex. And the thing that makes it complex is that it should be separate from the text. Separate from the text. And the final one is one that I added is, it's got to be okay for you. You've got to understand it so that you can take ownership of it. Murray's list is genius. So simple, so productive, and all the items on that list are significant contributors to producing a complex subtext. But the one that interested me most was this separate from the text concept, because it kind of made sense to me that if the way you label the subtext is the same as the text, if they're not separate, then they're not going to be readable to the audience. The audience won't be able to tell them apart because they're the same thing. It's essential that the element that's driving the subtext is different from the element that's driving the text. I mean, the way it works is that if, for example, I'm challenging you aggressively to be logical because you're not, but my unconscious psychological desire, which is what I'm now calling this label, is to be loved by you, then the difficulty, the conflict that exists between my desire to be loved and my aggressive challenge is in that area where that conflict, that cognitive dissonance lies, that generates the difficulty in making decisions. And that's the source of all those complex, myriad impulses that are subtext. And that makes sense, doesn't it? And so that concept of them being separate is really, really important, it seems to me. And so at that time I looked up what NIDA's definition of subtext was, and they said something like, it's anything that's not said or spoken. Now, that didn't make any sense to me at all. I mean, surely if you have a scene in which there's no dialogue, then surely there's still story happening, because that's why we're doing the scene, and surely the story is text. So does that definition mean that in a scene where there's no dialogue, there's no text? That doesn't make any sense. And I think that's one of the sources of confusions for actors, is that when things don't add up logically and link together, one thought concept supporting another, that's where the problem lies. I was talking to an actor recently, just a week or so ago, who just completed a 3-year acting course, and in the final session, when his teachers are saying to him, now, you're all set to go off and with this acting process and build your acting career, he's sitting there at that moment thinking, I don't think I have a process. And you can follow this confusion yourself. For example, one of the areas where actors are totally confused, and this actor said to me, "I don't understand objectives." And I think this is a classic example. You go and Google objectives, actors' objectives, and see what you get, and you'll get a variety of slightly different sort of explanations. But in the end, the most basic one it's going to be is the objective is what your character wants. And here's my first problem. It doesn't define whether that character's want or desire is a conscious desire or an unconscious one. There's no difference between them in that definition, and you and I know that. Unconscious desires produce entirely different impulses to conscious ones. Entirely different. That is a big problem. Murray's formula made so much sense that I started teaching it. And we worked on balancing unconscious and conscious impulses, but also we tried to discover what element of a scene carried the story. And what became plain was it wasn't the dialogue. The story wasn't driven forward line by line by line. The story was carried by what was happening while the characters were saying the lines. The story was carried forward while the characters in the scene had the conversation. And the conversation unfolded between the characters in the scene while they were saying the dialogue. So there was no point in analysing the text too much, and particularly if you consider that you can say yes, which could be a positive line on the page and make it a negative one, then analysing the text is a very unreliable measure or provider of information. What we discovered as we explored conversation is that characters had a conversation to help them manage the relationship. So we found that conversations were about relationship. It didn't matter whether you were lovers or enemies or gangsters or psychologists, therapists. What was happening was that characters were managing the relationship. And so we moved to a new phase, which was don't analyse the text, analyse the relationship. Every conversation was about relationship. And this did provide a fresh look at performance foundations. And this concept of focusing on conversations doesn't just apply to the scene. I recently saw a brilliant production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf at the Comedy Theatre. And this is a play in which a lot of topics are discussed, but you realise by the end of the play that the whole play is one conversation about one powerfully simple element that should be the foundation of the way we manage all our relationships. So it's not just about the scene, it can be about the whole play. We fell into defining conversation goals, and a conversation goal, of course, is what you are trying to achieve in the conversation in regard to the relationship. And in defining conversation goals, we made a big discovery. We worked out that in every relationship, we have issues with the other person's behaviour. It doesn't matter whether it's a good, strong, trusted, even loving relationship. We still have issues with the other person's behaviour. It's just that in a good relationship, we suppress our feelings about those issues. We don't let the issues, the problems get in the road of the fun of a good relationship. But in other relationships, the issues we have with behaviour can be a deal breaker. So we now have a new definition. An issue is a perceived problem with another person's behaviour. It's specific, it's concrete, and it's clear. So if you take the step to use this process, you'll have to be aware that you make sure that when you're sorting out issues, you're sorting out a problem with behaviour and you're not sorting out feelings. And that will probably happen because there's a long tradition in acting process of focusing on feelings, but the active choice is to make your conversation about the issue with the behaviour. For example, in a relationship that I have with someone, perhaps trust is the issue, that I'm not trusted, and therefore it doesn't matter what topic, what explanation I'm working towards in the conversation. If I can't manage the trust issue, they're not going to listen to the point that I have to make about the topic. So, issues in the conversation are the key factor that's determining the path we take through the conversation. And we also discovered that in life, every conversation has an instigator and a responder. And if you are starting the conversation, you know what you're trying to achieve. And if you're the responder, you instinctively know what your role is, and it affects your behaviour. Yet, actors never decide whether their character is the instigator or the responder, and they're therefore missing an essential bit of information that the character has in life. And it only takes 10 seconds to make that decision. That's a decision you should make in every scene you're in. And we also discovered that conversations have a form. And when you think about this, in life, we have numerous conversations all day, endlessly. We have conversations. And if we were going to form a new plan as to what path we would take through the conversation every time we had one, it would be a very stressful, tedious and tiring day. And so we have patterns that we use over and over depending on the relationship and the topic that we're dealing with. And we call those patterns of conversation the conversation form. And we discovered that if you're the instigator, there are only 3 forms of conversation. You can be testing to find out something that you don't know, and in which case that's a test form conversation. Or I could be challenging the other person, and in which case the form is a challenge. Or I could be battling for control. Now, all these forms have very specific definitions in the book, and you need to understand them clearly so that you can make functional choices. And if you're the responder and you understand these, then you know that the form you will use is to either do the same thing back that the instigator's doing at you, or you're going to resist what they're doing, avoid what they're doing, or deny that they're doing it at all. And so forms now give us the opportunity to create a new formula. So now when I have a scene in front of me, I can look at it and decide what issue do I have with this person in this relationship. And when I've done that, I can then decide which of those 3 forms of conversation, if I'm the instigator, which 3 forms of conversation will I use as the best way of dealing with that issue that I have with this person. So the form is going to be the best way of dealing with the issue. So if my issue is that they're not logical, then maybe I can battle for control to get them to be logical. Or I can test to see if they might be logical this time, or I can challenge them to be logical. And so now I have set myself up with those three opportunities, those three approaches of dealing with the character and the issue. I can set myself up so that from now on, rather than parroting words that I worked out the meaning of in rehearsal or even before, now I can listen to the progress I'm making in this relationship, and I can make the decisions now, in this instant, as the best way to progress and the best way to say my next line. So everything has changed. Now I am functioning in the scene the way I function in a conversation in life. And some people think that using formulas to make these decisions is a bit restrictive. But the reality is that it doesn't matter what decision you're making where, or what your job is, whether you're a surgeon, a lawyer, an electrician, a dog trainer. You're going to make decisions about how to progress using your experience of the best way of doing that job. Those are the formulas you're going to use. And psychologists have worked out the value of formulas. Daniel Kahneman, in his best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow, tells us that formulas help us make decisions because they sort out the key elements that will have the most effective outcome. And they also prevent us from making falsely based assumptions, and they also generally stop us making the cliche, like 9 out of 10 actors make the same decisions in the audition room. And so mostly formulas are the most efficient way of making decisions. And psychologist Paul Neal says there are few circumstances under which it's a good idea to substitute judgment, the intuitive choice, for a formula. So formulas are going to give us the freedom to be playful in performance, because they define a clear pathway. And when we're clear about the path that we can follow, then we have the freedom to play our way down that path in any way we choose. Whereas intuitive restrictions have a much narrower band, provide a much narrower band of opportunity. And think about this. If when you look at your scene, you come up with 3 valid issues that your character could have with the other character, and then if you're the instigator of the conversation, you've got 3 forms of conversation that you can use, which you could pair up with those issues in any way that you wanted to, you now go into the audition room with 9, 3 times 3, 9 options that you can play with, and that you could move between those choices in seconds and be confident and clear about the path you're now going to take through the conversation. That is being flexible. And there were other things that we learnt about conversation. We learnt that, for example, it's important that in a conversation you always keep stepping up. That's what you do in life. The next thing you say in a conversation is more important than the last thing you said, because that's why you're saying it. And we also discovered that it was important to keep endings up, because when you keep the ending up, that drives the drama forward. And surprisingly, it's also really important in comedy. And we also learnt that important words had incredible value, because when you pick out an important word in a line, that suddenly brings point of view to your character. Their perspective becomes clear. And as a result, the performance is more complex. Now, all these discoveries were really exciting, but there's still one element that we haven't explored properly, and that's the subtext that we were mentioning at the start. Now, subtext is generated when our mind is doing two things at once, because our mind can only do one thing at a time, and when it's trying to balance those two things, that's where that myriad of extra impulses come from in the background. And so while we were exploring Murray's formula to generate subtext, we discovered we were actually doing something else as well. We discovered that we were also creating the character. Now, character is an area where there is a huge amount of confusion for actors, and you can test this out yourself. Just go and Google creating a character and see what pops up, and it doesn't matter whether they are experienced, long-time serving professional acting coaches, or whether they're highly experienced actors, whether they're stars. Everything they'll tell you is waffle. It's vague. You're not going to get any information that tells you this is what you need to do to create a character. But in fact, the concept of creating character is very simple. And you can test this out too, because all you've got to do is ask someone you know to describe their best friend to you. You ask them to describe their best friend on the basis you're going to meet them tomorrow, and what do you need to know? And when I tried this in a class, the actor who volunteered said, "Oh, my best friend never listens and always thinks he's right." It seems like he's describing the issues that he has with his best friend, but he's also describing the consistent patterns of his friend's behaviour that he recognises, and those consistent patterns of behaviour reveal his best friend's nature or character. So it's behaviour that reveals character. Consistent patterns of behaviour create character. So how do we manage this? How do we put something in place to create the character? And what we do is we choose a verb from this list. You do not need the actor's thesaurus. You should throw it away at this point. It's too complicated, and it generally means you make choices that are inactive or internally focused. Stick to this list. So what happens is you decide from that list what your character's unconscious desire is with the other character in the conversation. And then you drop it in. That's the expression I use. You drop it in and take ownership of it. So you allow yourself to know that. That's what you want. You allow yourself to know, for example, that you want to be liked by that character. And when you know that, you can forget about it, because you now know it, and it's now going to sit in the background. And what that will then do is monitor your behaviour in the conversation, because, for example, if my conversation goal is to challenge you to see that you never listen, then if I want to be liked, I'm only going to push that challenge so far. I'm only going to push it to the point where it doesn't stop you liking me, because of my unconscious psychological desire. And so my desire to be liked will set the parameters of the behaviour for my conversation goal. On the other hand, if my unconscious desire of you is to dominate you, then obviously I can go much further up the aggressive scale to challenge you to see that you don't listen, because not only am I working towards achieving my conversation goal, but I'm also achieving my desire to dominate you. And so the desire to dominate and the desire to be liked set very different parameters of behaviour for my character in the scene. And if I change my unconscious psychological desire between, just take those two examples, then the story outcome is now going to be very different. So my unconscious psychological desire and my conscious conversation goals are going to be significant tools, major tools, in determining the story that I deliver to the audience. Stick to that list. You do not need any more to create huge varieties of characters. And the thing about that list is that they're so simple and so active, and you have such an immediate understanding of them that you don't have to put any homework into using them. So they're very efficient. They're incredibly effective, and they will sit in the background and function in life the way our unconscious psychological desires do. Now, there are other formulas in this book about how to set yourself up to balance your conscious and unconscious choices. And there's also a formula about how to assess how you went after a run so that you can decide whether your choices were effective or not. But in the end, what we're talking about here is that by using your conscious conversation goal and your unconscious psychological desire, you can set yourself up, provided that the choices you make are active, externally focused, difficult to achieve, separate from the text, and that you understand them clearly so that they're okay for you, then you can set yourself up to deliver complex, believable and engaging performances. And what's more, you're going to be incredibly flexible in rehearsal and in the audition room, because you've got so many options to play with. And think about this. If you've come up with 3 issues for your character, and if you're the instigator, you've got 3 conversation goals, which gives you 9 options. Well, if 9, for example, of those unconscious psychological desires will also change the nature of the story you're delivering, you're now going into the audition room with 9 times 9, 81 options that you can move between seamlessly without any stress, just by changing choices that you understand that are efficient and practical. And that's why actors like Glenn Quinn and Akina Edmonds and Stephanie Kakamo and Deirdre Koo and Carla Gare, who's going to be the lead in My Brilliant Career in the Melbourne Theatre Company in November of this year, why they find these techniques do provide a fresh approach to more confident performances, because they understand what they're doing, and what they're doing makes sense. There are many more formulas and techniques that we've explored in classes that aren't in this book, and so I had been deciding that maybe I should start on the next volume. But it occurred to me during the seminar that if you are interested in receiving the chapters of the new book as they are written, then all you need to do is email me at richard rehearsalroom.com and put "Yes please" in the subject line, and I'll put you on the list. They're not going to come out in a rush, obviously, if you're prepared to wait, then you can receive the chapters as they are written rather than waiting for 4 years or something for the book. I look forward to hearing from you. How do you use this technique if the actor opposite you isn't using it or is doing something different? That is a very good question, particularly if you're only recently familiar with this process. And because it's so organised, you see that all the bits are connected. But the reality is that the connections are about the ones that you make. And this is a process that's driven by your listening. I always say I'm training actors to be listening driven, not text driven. And so in life, you use your listening to make your next decision. And so if the actor opposite you is using their own techniques, which in fact they will be more than likely, then all you've got to do is listen. And another factor here is that these processes are based on the way you conduct a conversation in life, the way your mind works. And so because they're based on life, in life you don't know what the other character is doing, you don't know what processes they're using, you just have to listen to them and form your opinions and make your next decision. And that's what you should be doing when you're acting. So it doesn't matter what the other person is doing. And in fact, I had an actor I know recently who says she uses this process in life, not just as an actor. She works in a fairly high-level job where she's working with politicians and public servants and members of the public. And she said she uses this process all the time, and it's fantastic. Now, she didn't tell me which aspects and why, but I'm assuming that she uses it because it gives her a clear path through her conversation and gets her listening well to the conversation and to an understanding of the other person that she's talking to. So, yeah, it doesn't matter what the other person is doing. You should just be able to set yourself up to listen and pursue your conversation goal. But the important thing about this process is that when you're setting yourself up with your plan of action is all about the other person. So you're not going to get internally focused on, this is how I have to do it. It's all going to depend on what the other person does as to how you react. So, good question and a really simple answer. It's easy. How does this process work for monologues? Well, it works brilliantly for monologues. But you need to know that, in fact, the word monologue is actually banned in the rehearsal room classes because it sets off, in my view, a whole lot of triggers in the actor's mind that are anti-conversation. My view is that if you are talking, you are actually talking to someone. And if you're talking to someone, you're having a conversation. Now, I live on my own, and so I do talk to myself a lot. And what I first thought was that I was talking to my other self. But I discovered that, in fact, in life, it's the other self that's talking to me that's going to say, it says to me like, Richard, what'd you bloody do that for? Or, oh, well done, that went well. Or it's the other self that's informing the inadequate me. But whether you're doing a monologue where you're talking to somebody who isn't there, or whether you're talking to the audience, you're always talking to someone. or your other self. And so conversation goal rules, the patterns of conversation, still apply. And when you're thinking about conversation and making the point that you're trying to make to the person you're talking to, you're not going to get into these word-driven performances that people do in monologues. They've got to make this word make this point and that word make another point, and so it now becomes acted and controlled and contrived rather than a spontaneous conversation that's finding the best way to explore a concept. So one of the reasons that monologue is banned in my classes is that often actors will look at a big speech in a scene and go, oh, I've got a monologue. Well, you haven't got a monologue. You're still having a conversation. You're still making a point to the person you're talking to and managing that relationship at the same time. Everything's the same. So my advice about long speeches is don't treat them as a long speech. Treat them as a series of short ones that you're sticking together. And another way of thinking about a monologue is that, which I think is really useful, is that it's not just you. You're having a conversation with another person who isn't actually talking back, but they're agreeing or they're disagreeing or they're being amused. And so when you're doing a monologue to someone who isn't there, you're always interacting with them. So a good way of rehearsing monologues, in my view, is to initially do your early rehearsals with someone who will talk back to you. So you get used to how they receive the points you're making, and they can actually vocalise back. And then on a later run, a rehearsal, they maybe don't vocalise back, but you see the responses from their physicality, so that you keep that long speech listening, impulse driven. Yeah, you're right. 3 of the verbs on our playable verbs list are different colours. And they're different colours for a reason, of course, because they deliver different outcomes. And that's one of the constants about this approach to acting, is that when you make a choice about either conversation goal or unconscious psychological desire, when you put them in place, you can expect that you are going to get a specific outcome within a general area, but you should be getting the result that you want from using those ingredients. And if you don't get the result, when you look at it back or when your director says they're not getting what they want, then you need to change the ingredients so that you do get a result. The result you get from the to share unconscious psychological desire is it unfailingly creates likeable characters. So if your director is saying to you, I really want to like your character, then they're saying that because they're not liking you enough, and so maybe to be liked or to please or whatever isn't doing the job. So if you get a note that they want you to be more likeable, our rule is drop in to share as the need, because to share unfailingly creates likeable characters, because sharers can be quite dominant or even aggressive. But the thing about a sharer is that they want you to know their opinion, but they also want to hear yours. And that equity that's in their listening is what makes the character likeable. So to share creates likeable characters. To blame creates darker and, in due course, unlikable characters. And so does to challenge, which is likely to create sort of narcissistic type of characters when those tools are used as an unconscious psychological desire. So They're coloured because we need to be reminded when we look at our list of verbs that they have a specific purpose. Yes, I did mention that keeping endings up is good for comedy, because that's incredibly true. It's a very useful thing to keep in mind when you're playing comedy. Keeping endings up is great for drama because it keeps the purpose and the energy of any line moving forward to the end. If you start dropping off endings of lines, then you take the energy of the communication away. So keeping it up in drama is really important, and keeping endings up in comedy is equally important, because there's a bit of a myth about comedy, I think, that people tend to, or actors tend to think that they have to be funny if they're playing a role that makes people laugh. But that's not true. Frequently, in my view, the things that make us laugh in a comedy is the level of difficulty that the characters are facing, and that difficulty is essentially the drama. So comedy is driven by drama just as much as drama is, the difference being that the writer has created dramatic circumstances that are a bit weird, that are ironic, unusual or whatever, and so the writer's done all the work in being funny. You, the comic actor, just have to be believable and pursue the believability of the circumstances to the hilt, and keeping endings up does that. When you keep your endings up, it's more than likely that's where the laugh will be. Although for the character, it's perhaps the moment of greatest difficulty. Excuse me. Keeping endings up, really important no matter what you're doing. And in fact, it's important in life to make sure that you keep making clearly your point.